1758, and I'm returning from that French and Indian War. I resigned my commission as colonel and returned to my Mount Vernon. I had two prime concerns at that time. My getting Mount Vernon back into a profitable situation, of course, and my recent marriage to the widow Custis and taking care of her two children, Jackie and Patsy. You understand our 5 farms at Mount Vernon were in a state of neglect. I suppose with me having been away during the war years, and my sister-in-law Anne, who remarried and moved out of Mount Vernon. But also our cash crop of tobacco, we learned from our broker in England, was declining in value. So I took matters somewhat into my own hands, and I began experimenting with crops. I made wheat my cash crop. I even opened a grist mill. But it seemed like no matter what we did, our mother country kept us in some type of financial stress, as she thought we should have to help pay for that French and Indian War and the debt that was incurred. She began taxing us. The Stamp Act, the sugar tax, those Townsend duties they were. They taxed our basic necessities: lead, paint, glass, dye, and even our tea. And I know what you're thinking. They repealed all those taxes. And indeed, they did repeal most of them. But if you go back to when the first British subjects came to this new land for opportunity and freedom and settled in 1607 at Jamestown, from that time till now, over 150 years has passed. From that time till now, we were pretty much left to our own devices as far as governing, taxing, and running our own personal affairs. So these new taxes, without us having any voice in them whatsoever, were quite an imposition.
Well, unrest was getting much worse, and I could tell that change was just around the corner. As a group of men formed and called themselves the Sons of Liberty and began to protest the tea tax, a group of women decided to form. They called themselves the Daughters of Liberty. Well, this surprised the colonial men and the British as well, because, you see, women were not involved in politics. But up and down the colonies, groups of women continued to form, and they created their own protests of British-grown tea and English-made clothing. I initially didn't participate in those protests. Some accused me of being a loyalist. I think because earlier I had 2 brothers and an uncle in the Royal Navy, and I belonged to Williamsburg Court, and they did not support any of the boycotts.
No, those protests spread all up and down the seaboard. All 13 colonies were involved. They went from tar and feathering local tax collectors. Of course, that would discourage anyone else from taking that position and keep them from collecting the taxes. We wrote letters of redress for our grievances to the King and Parliament, and of course we would not buy those British goods that were being taxed. We were being taxed for. But the worst of the protests were up in New England, you know, in Massachusetts probably. In Boston in 1770, there were a group of protesters, patriots, protesting a tax. The Redcoats, troops came in. Shots were fired. Afterwards, 5 of those innocent protesters lay dead in the streets. And sometime after that, in Boston Harbor, there were 3 revenue ships. They were carrying goods that were being taxed. The citizens refused to unload that product. The governor of this colony insisted it be unloaded. So the Liberty Boys, with a group of protesters, patriots, boarded those ships one night and proceeded to cast over 300 chests into the harbor, into the ocean. They called that the Boston Tea Party. Well, the king did not see any amusement in that. He proceeded to pass the coercive acts. We call it the intolerable acts, as they closed the port of Boston, greatly crippling her economy. They took control of the Massachusetts government and courts, and also made them house British soldiers in their private lodgings, as well as, of course, pay for that tea that was thrown overboard. Well, with insurrections such as this, is it any wonder that the protests spread up and down through all 13 colonies? I mean, who is going to be next to suffer the wrath of the king and Parliament?
Well, I feel I must explain why I initially didn't participate in any of those protests. You see, we were intent to maintain our daughter Patsy's social standing, so we continued to order her clothing from London. But we soon discovered that the price and quality of those goods weren't as they used to be, and the mother country wasn't sending us fine things as she once did. Now, this became very unimportant. In 1773, we lost our dear Patsy at age 17 to a severe seizure.